The sun had just begun to stretch across the rolling hills of Boone, North Carolina. It was early spring, and the last traces of frost still clung to the window panes of the Thompson family's modest cabin, nestled at the edge of a winding road that led nowhere in particular. Inside, the scent of sizzling bacon and maple syrup filled the air. Claire Thompson stood barefoot in the kitchen, wrapped in her oversized cardigan, flipping pancakes while humming an old James Taylor tune under her breath. Her husband, David, emerged from the hallway with a yawn, scratching the back of his neck, hair tousled like he'd been wrestling with dreams. He bent to kiss Claire on the cheek and poured himself a cup of black coffee from the percolator. "Smells like a Sunday morning," he said, sipping. Claire smiled but said nothing. Her mind was already drifting, her body unusually tired despite a full night's sleep. She had felt off for days, waves of nausea, persistent dizziness, and the kind of fatigue that clung to her bones. But it wasn't the season for flu, and the kids had been healthy. That left only one possibility, and her late period had confirmed it. Lily and Max, their 6 and 4-year-olds, were still asleep in the small bedroom at the end of the hall. Claire glanced at the clock, 7:02 a.m., and returned to her thoughts. She hadn't told David yet. She hadn't told anyone. Not until she was sure. Later that afternoon, while David took the kids to the park, Claire drove alone to the nearest pharmacy. The blue and white box sat like a secret in the passenger seat the entire way home. She waited until the kids were tucked in and David had fallen asleep on the couch before locking herself in the bathroom. It didn't take long. 2 lines. Bold. Pink. Unmistakable. Claire sat on the edge of the bathtub, staring at the test. Her heart beat loud in her ears. Not out of surprise, no, they had talked about the possibility of a third child, though more in the abstract. Maybe in a few years, if things settle down. But they hadn't planned for this. And now, staring at those 2 pink lines, the reality came rushing in. Their life was already full, already stretched. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Claire handed David his coffee as he sat at the table scrolling through emails. His job as a freelance electrical engineer had grown steadier over the last 2 years, but it was still inconsistent. One month they were fine, the next they barely scraped by. "Hey," she said gently. "I need to tell you something." He looked up, concerned. "What is wrong?" Claire sat down, folle d'un heure en together. "I'm pregnant." David's face froze for a second. His eyes searched hers. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "I took a test. Last night." He leaned back, running a hand down his face. "Wow. Yeah." They sat in silence for a moment. Then David chuckled softly. "Well, I guess Lily was right. She said she wanted a baby sister for her birthday." Claire smiled, but it quickly faded. "I should see the doctor. Make sure everything's okay." David agreed and made the appointment for the following Thursday. They didn't tell the kids. Not yet. When Thursday came, Claire wore her favorite sweater, the soft one with the gray sleeves, and braided her hair like she always did when she was nervous. David insisted on coming with her, even though he had a project deadline. They drove in silence, hands clasped tightly on the center console. The Boone Community Medical Center was small, one of those buildings that hadn't changed much since the early 80s. The waiting room was quiet. A mother rocked a fussy baby in the corner while the receptionist tapped away on a keyboard. Dr. Ellis Monroe was a seasoned OB-GYN with silvering hair and kind eyes. He greeted them warmly and began the ultrasound. It took less than a minute for the air to shift. Claire felt it first, not pain, but tension. Dr. Monroe's expression changed. His cheerful tone faded, replaced by a careful, clinical focus. He moved the wand slowly, then paused. Moved again. His brow furrowed. David sat up straighter. "Is everything all right?" Dr. Monroe didn't answer right away. Then finally, he looked at them. "Claire, you're not carrying one baby. Or 2. Clairesse briscogt. There are 4 distinct heartbeats. Silence. 4. Claire stared at the screen. David blinked like he hadn't heard correctly. "I'm sorry, did you say 4? Dr. Monroe nodded. "You're having quadruplets. Spontaneous, natural quadruplets. All sharing the same gestational timeline. This is incredibly rare, about 1 in 10 million. Claire didn't respond. She couldn't. Her mind splintered.
David leaned forward.
We didn't do any fertility treatment. No IVF.
No hormone therapy.
I understand, the doctor replied. This is spontaneous, which makes it even rarer. But I need you to understand the seriousness of this pregnancy. He handed them a folder filled with terms Claire barely processed: preterm labor, preeclampsia, fetal growth restriction, maternal mortality. On the last page was a bold heading: selective fetal reduction. Dr. Monroe looked them in the eye. With quadruplets, especially natural ones, the risks to both the mother and the fetuses are significantly elevated. Most successful cases involve reducing the number of fetuses to improve survival chances. I don't say this lightly. I say it because I've seen what happens when we don't have that conversation.
Claire felt the floor slipping away. 4 yards.
4 lives. David sat frozen, the paperwork trembling in his hands. On the drive home, neither of them spoke.
The rain tapait lightly on the windshield.
The wipers swished back and forth in perfect rhythm with the storm that had begun to gather inside them. Claire stared out the window, her voice barely audible.
I can't do it, David.
He looked at her. Do what? I can't choose. I can't decide which one gets to live. I'm their mother. David gripped the steering wheel tighter, his jaw clenched. And just like that, the line was drawn. The following morning, Claire sat in the kitchen, unmoving, staring into a mug of lukewarm tea. The children were playing quietly in the living room, unaware that their mother's world had tilted dangerously the day before. David paced the floor, his phone clutched in his hand, unread emails piling up as he tried to make sense of the whirlwind they had been thrown into. He had stayed up late reading medical articles, scanning statistics, trying to understand what the numbers meant, what it meant to be a family of 6 instead of 4, what it meant to carry 4 babies in a single womb, what the survival rates were. Claire finally broke the silence. If we reduce, she said, how do we choose? Do we pick the ones furthest from the uterus wall? Do we let a doctor decide which heartbeats to end? David sat across from her, arms crossed.
I don't know.
There are 4 babies, she said, her voice trembling, and they are already alive. Their hearts are beating, David. I saw them. He didn't answer. He had no answer that wouldn't sound cruel or incomplete. Later that day, they returned to the clinic to meet with Dr. Monroe again. He greeted them with that same calm tone, the one Claire had begun to associate with bad news disguised in bedside manner. He motioned them into the small consultation room. I know yesterday was overwhelming, he began. But now that the news has had time to settle, I'd like us to talk through your options again. This isn't a decision to make quickly, but it's also not one we can delay for long. Claire nodded slowly, her hands resting on her stomach, which had yet to even show.
I understand.
But I need to be honest. I don't think I can do it. I can't terminate any of them. Dr. Monroe didn't flinch. He sat back in his chair, folding his hands. Claire, he said gently, I've delivered hundreds of babies. I've seen triplets, twins, high-risk pregnancies. But quadruplets, especially natural ones like yours, are among the most dangerous. The statistics are difficult. The chances of all 4 surviving, and you remaining healthy, are. I don't need the numbers, she interrupted. I already know the risk. I feel it. David shifted beside her. What if we try to carry all 4? What kind of monitoring are we talking about?
Docteur, Monroe exhaled.
You'd be transferred to a high-risk maternal unit at the University Hospital in Charlotte.
Weekly scan.
Possible hospital bed rest from 20 weeks. Early delivery is almost guaranteed. Likely C-section around 28 to 30 weeks, maybe earlier. The babies will need NICU care, possibly for months.
And Claire?
David asked. Dr. Monroe paused. She'll be monitored constantly. But the risk of preeclampsia, gestational diabetes, hemorrhage, they all increase. It's not just about the babies. It's about her life too.
The room fell silent again.
Then came a voice neither of them expected. I would keep them, said Nina Carter, the young nurse who had just entered with the next appointment chart in hand. She blinked, realizing she had spoken out loud. Sorry, she added quickly, her face flushing. Dr. Monroe raised an eyebrow. You have something to say, Nurse Carter?
She hesitated. I've seen women choose reduction. And I respect it. But I've also seen women fight for every heartbeat. And sometimes, despite the odds, those babies make it. Claire looked at her, tears in her eyes. Have you seen them make it? All four. Nina looked down. Only once. But it changed the way I see things. Dr. Monroe didn't contradict her, but his expression was grave. Just once, he repeated. Out of how many? Claire and David left the clinic without scheduling a reduction. That night, David sat in the living room, the television on but muted, watching his children build a fort out of couch cushions. Lily wrapped a scarf around her shoulders like a cape and announced she was the queen. Max responded by pretending to fly. David looked over at Claire, who stood in the doorway. If we lose you, he said softly, what happens to them? Claire stepped into the room, kneeling beside him. If we reduce and I survive, I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive myself. But what if the cost is too high? Claire's eyes met his. Then we pay it together. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't recklessness. It was simply the clearest truth she knew how to live with. A week later, Claire was admitted to the maternal fetal unit in Charlotte, more than 2 hours from Boone. David arranged childcare with Claire's mother, Helen, and began commuting back and forth, juggling work, kids, and hospital visits. Claire's pregnancy advanced under strict medical watch. Every day became a test. Her blood pressure was monitored 3 times a day. She was injected with steroids to help the baby's lungs develop early. She wore compression socks. She was encouraged not to walk more than a few feet per day. She counted the days not by a calendar, but by each successful checkup, each scan that still showed 4 flickering heartbeats. She kept a small notebook on the bedside table and wrote in it nightly. Day 9, Ivy is still the smallest. But her heart is steady. Hope kicked today. It startled me. Max would laugh if he saw me flinch. David visited as often as he could. On the nights he couldn't make it, he'd video call and let the kids talk to her. Lily once held up a picture she'd drawn of their family, now including 4 little stick figures, all with pink bows. One night, as David sat beside her hospital bed, Claire whispered, "Do you think I'm being selfish?" He looked at her. No. I think you're being brave. But I won't lie and say I'm not scared out of my mind. Me too, she whispered. They held hands in the low hospital light. The monitor beeped steadily in the background, a soft percussion to the quiet fight they were waging together. At 20 weeks, Claire began to show signs of early contractions. Dr. Monroe increased the frequency of her medications and recommended complete bed rest. A nurse was assigned to monitor her 24/7. The risk of preterm labor loomed large. David moved into temporary housing nearby. His freelance contract slowed, his savings dwindled, and he worked remotely at night. During the day, he played with Lily and Max, drove them to daycare, cooked meals, and then visited Claire with homemade soup. Claire's mother took time off work and moved in to help. She cooked, cleaned, did laundry, and whispered words of comfort to her daughter during midnight panics. Meanwhile, the outside world went on. Friends from Boone sent cards. Some neighbors called to say they were praying. Others, less sympathetic, began to whisper. "You heard about the Thompsons?" One mother at the local grocery store said. "She's having 4. Can you believe it? I heard she refused to reduce. Isn't that dangerous?" Sounds irresponsible. But Claire didn't hear those voices. Not yet. All she heard were the 4 quiet thumps inside her, growing stronger each day. By the time Claire reached 24 weeks, the hospital room had become her entire world. The sterile white walls, the soft whirring of machines, the scent of antiseptic mixed with lavender lotion she kept by the bed, these were the constants. She was now on complete bed rest. Even turning in bed required assistance, and she had to buzz for a nurse just to use the restroom. The days blurred, stitched together by blood pressure checks, ultrasounds, meals she barely touched, and the nightly sound of 4 heartbeats on the fetal monitor. She had stopped counting in weeks. Now it was just days. Every 24 hours that passed without complications felt like a quiet victory. Dr. Monroe remained firm professional, but Claire saw it in his eyes. The pressure was mounting. The babies were growing, but not evenly. Ivy, the smallest, continued to lag. Her heartbeat remained steady, but she was significantly behind in weight. Hope and Grace were tracking close together. Faith was just a little ahead. Claire had memorized the patterns. "You're doing everything right, Nina," the nurse often said during her overnight shifts. She was the only one who spoke with softness, like she was speaking to a person and not a patient.
"Sommetti mi fil like a vaisselle," Claire whispered one night. "Nothing more." Nina shook her head. "You're a mother. That is never nothing."
Meanwhile, David was unraveling. Back in Boone, he had returned to the house every few days to gather supplies or mail. But mostly he stayed in a cramped rental apartment in Charlotte, juggling freelance work in the evenings and full-time parenting during the day. Claire's mother, Helen, helped when she could, but she was 62 and already exhausted. David began missing calls, forgetting appointments, and snapping more often. One night, while trying to make dinner, Max spilled a pot of uncooked pasta on the floor and burst into tears. David didn't yell, but he sat down in the middle of the mess and started crying too. Lily came and wrapped her arms around his neck.
"It's okay, Daddy.
We can clean it up together." At night, when the kids were finally asleep, he'd lie awake on the pull-out couch, staring at the ceiling, wondering how much more they could endure. Bills were stacking up. Insurance didn't cover everything. Claire's hospitalization was expensive, and even with help from her school district and some emergency grants, they were hemorrhaging money. He began applying for remote jobs he had no experience in.
Anything to slow the bleeding."
When he visited Claire, he tried to hide his exhaustion, but she saw through it. His beard was unkempt. His clothes smelled faintly of reheated dinners and baby wipes. He barely spoke during visits, nodding along to updates from doctors, smiling for the kids when they video called, but otherwise remaining silent. One afternoon, Claire finally confronted him. "You haven't looked me in the eye in 3 days." David didn't respond. "Talk to me," she pleaded. He rubbed his face.
"What do you want me to say?" "The truth."
He exhaled slowly, leaning forward in the chair beside her bed. "I don't know how to do this, Claire.
"I'm scared all the time.
Every morning I wake up thinking this might be the day the phone rings and—" His voice broke. She reached for his hand. "I know. And I hate that I can't fix this," he said.
"I'm used to fixing things.
Wiring. Panels.
Circuit.
There's a solution. But this?
I'm powerless. I can't make the money stretch.
I can't be in 2 places at once.
I can't sleep. I can't breathe without worrying I'm missing something."
"You're not powerless," she said.
"You're holding us together."
He looked at her then, truly looked.
"And what if I can't keep holding?"
Claire didn't answer. She didn't have an answer. All she had was resolve, and even that was beginning to fray. A few days later, Claire received an email from her school principal. It was short, supportive, and included screenshots of a fundraiser the staff had started for her family. The note ended with, "You're not alone, Claire. Let us carry part of this." She cried for 10 minutes after reading it. Meanwhile, Lily had stopped asking when her mom was coming home. She didn't cry about it anymore. Instead, she grew quieter. She spent hours drawing pictures and folding them into small envelopes, which David collected and brought to the hospital. Max asked fewer questions but had started wetting the bed again. The children missed their mother in a way they couldn't articulate. Claire missed them in a way that hurt physically. One evening, David brought Lily and Max to the hospital for a brief visit. It was the first time in weeks they were allowed to come in. Claire had been stabilized, and the doctors agreed to let the children see her for 10 minutes under strict monitoring. The moment Lily saw Claire lying in the hospital bed, IVs in her arm, monitors beeping, she froze. "Mommy," she whispered. Claire smiled through tears.
Sweetheart."
Lily walked slowly to the bed, Max clinging to David's leg. Claire opened her arms as far as she could, and Lily climbed up carefully, resting her head on her mother's shoulder. "You don't feel like you," Lily said quietly. "I know," Claire said. "But I'm still me."
"I'm just a little tired."
Max finally approached, holding a stuffed rabbit. "We brought you Mr. Bun." Claire took the rabbit with trembling hands. "I missed him. And I missed you." After they left, Claire lay back against her pillows, emotionally drained. She closed her eyes,
feeling the tightness in her abdomen return, subtle but there. The next morning, she had a scan. Dr. Monroe's expression was unusually tense as he entered the room with the results.
Claire, your cervix is thinning.
That means we're getting closer to labor than we'd like.
You're not in active labor yet, but we're watching closely. She nodded slowly. Ivy is still struggling. Her growth has plateaued again.
Claire looked at the ceiling. She imagined the four of them in her womb, curled together like seeds in a pod, fighting for space, for blood, for breath.
Later that evening, she wrote in her notebook. Day 27, I wonder if they know me yet. If they can tell the difference between silence and sorrow. I try to sing to them at night. I think they like the sound.
When Nina came in for the night shift, she found Claire still awake. Do you ever get used to the fear?
Claire asked her. No, Nina replied. But you learn to live beside it. David called late that night. His voice was low, exhausted. Max cried for an hour after bedtime. He wanted you to sing. Lily didn't say anything. Just sat by the window with your picture. Claire swallowed the lump in her throat. Tell them I'm singing.
Every night.
They just have to listen real close.
And so the days went on, each one tighter than the last.
The house in Boone sat empty, waiting.
The hospital room became a sanctuary, a prison, a womb within a womb. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew, the clock was ticking.
At 28 weeks and 3 days, Claire woke up gasping for air.
The pain hit suddenly, not like a contraction, but a crushing pressure in her chest, a wave of dizziness so strong it blurred the edges of her vision. She pressed the call button, fumbling for it in the dark, as the monitor next to her bed let out a shrill alarm. Within seconds, Nina and another nurse rushed into the room.
Claire tried to speak, but her words slurred. Her head lolled slightly to one side.
Blood pressure's through the roof, Nina said, her voice tight.
180/115. We need Dr. Monroe now. They moved quickly. An oxygen mask was fitted over Claire's face.
One nurse inserted a second 4 line.
Another began prepping emergency meds.
Claire could hear the rising pitch of urgency in their voices, though her own heartbeat drowned most of it out.
Her skin felt hot, flushed, like fire beneath the surface.
Dr. Monroe appeared minutes later, already pulling on gloves.
She's in early onset eclampsia, he said, scanning the chart. Visual disturbances, hypertension, risk of seizure.
We're out of time.
He turned to Nina. Call the OR. We're taking her in.
No, Claire whispered, trying to lift her head.
The babies, it's too early.
Monroe looked down at her with a firmness that brokered no negotiation.
Claire, if we don't deliver now, you may not survive the night.
The world shifted then, sound, color, time. Everything moved in fragments.
Claire was wheeled down the corridor under bright lights, ceiling panels flashing past like snapshots.
She could barely hear David's voice over the chaos. Someone must have called him.
I'm here, he was saying, somewhere beside her, gripping her hand.
Amir, Claire. Yves got you.
A nurse placed a clipboard in front of him.
A surgical consent form.
Sign here, she said. And initial there.
If we have to choose, do we prioritize the mother?
David froze, pen overing.
His hand trembled.
His eyes flicked to Claire's, wide and terrified behind the oxygen mask.
He swallowed hard, then signed.
In the operating room, the team moved with mechanical precision. The anesthesiologist administered a spinal block.
Claire was positioned, prepped, draped. The lights were too bright. She was cold.
Her teeth chattered despite the warming blanket. Dr. Monroe stood at the head of the table, hands poised.
We're going to move quickly, he said.
We're going to try to save them all.
At 2:17 a.m., the first incision was made.
The surgical team worked in near silence, broken only by the measured calls of instruments and vitals.
Within minutes, the first baby was delivered. Hope. She let out a weak but immediate cry.
First girl out, a nurse announced, passing the tiny infant to the NICU team.
1 minute later, Grace.
Her cry was thinner.
Then came Faith, her breathing labored but present.
Evie was last.
As Dr. Monroe reached for her, the monitors flatlined.
No yard Bea, One nurse called out. Nos fetal pulses sont IV.
Apneic.
Flaccid, said another. There was a pause, just seconds, but it felt like time itself held its breath.
Do we call it? Someone asked. No, Dr. Monroe snapped.
Bagger. Stimulat.
They worked.
Tiny compression.
Oxygen.
A sliver of adrenaline administered with a needle no longer than a pinky.
Sti silence.
Then, a flicker.
A fin twitch.
A gasp. She's trying to breathe, Nina called.
IV goutte à pulse. 60 and rising. Claire, semi-conscious, wept.
Don't let her go, she whispered.
Please.
But Claire's blood pressure was plummeting now. She had begun to hemorrhage internally, the result of a uterine tear compounded by the stress of the emergency surgery. The anesthesiologist shouted numbers, increasing her fluids and calling for additional transfusions.
She's crashing, someone said. Dr. Monroe looked up. His face was pale. Clamp it, he ordered. I'm going to need another set of hands. We've got uterine atony.
I can't get the bleeding under control. Time sped up again.
They gave Claire 4 units of blood. She lost consciousness.
David waited in the hallway, pacing, his hands still stained with ink from the consent forms.
A nurse finally appeared, her scrubs spotted with blood. She made it through surgery, she said. But there were complications. She's in recovery now. She's stable, but it was close. David stared at her.
And the babies.
All 4 are alive. Critical, but alive. They're in the NICU now.
She placed a hand gently on his shoulder.
They fought. So did she.
Hours later, Claire woke to the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen machine. Her mouth was dry, her body cold and heavy. She blinked, struggling to remember where she was.
Then she heard it.
A sound like a soft cry. No, not just one.
Multiple.
She turned her head slowly. There, through the glass, just outside her room, she saw 4 incubators.
Nurses moved quietly between them. Machines blinked and hummed. Tiny arms flailed. One baby kicked weakly. Another yawned, her mouth a perfect O.
David sat beside her bed, holding her hand.
You're here, she murmured.
I never left, he said.
Her voice cracked.
Are they?
They're alive, he whispered.
All of them. He leaned in closer. You almost didn't make it.
Claire closed her eyes, and tears slipped from the corners.
But I did, she said. We did.
The NICU would be their new home now, for weeks, maybe months. The babies were barely over 2 pounds each. They would need breathing support, feeding tubes, and around-the-clock monitoring. Claire would remain in recovery for several days. But in that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was that they were all still here. Later, a nurse brought in a clipboard with name tags for the NICU.
Do you want to name them officially? She asked gently.
Claire looked at David, then nodded.
She pointed, one by one.
DC soap.
That's Grace. Faith is next.
And the little one. Evie.
The nurse smiled as she wrote the names on the tags.
They're beautiful.
Claire turned her head toward the incubators again, her voice soft but sure.
They're fighters.
She meant all of them, babies, doctors, nurses, David.
Herself.
In the quiet after the storm, with tubes in her arms and stitches in her skin, Claire let her eyes close. Her body ached, her heart bruised, but inside her, something fierce and full of light began to bloom.
She had chosen not to reduce.
She had chosen to risk everything.
And tonight, against the odds, she had won.
The morning after surgery, the hospital room was quiet except for the occasional beep of monitors and the faint hum of machines outside the glass that separated Claire's room from the NICU. She drifted in and out of sleep, her body heavy from medication, her abdomen wrapped tight beneath layers of bandages. Pain ebbed and surged like the tide, but beneath it all was something stronger, an awareness that she was still here.
Alive.
Barely, perhaps. But here.
David sat by her side, still in the same clothes from the night before, one hand gently resting on hers.
He hadn't moved in hours. When Claire stirred, he straightened. You're awake, he whispered, his voice hoarse. She nodded weakly, trying to speak, but her throat was too dry.
David poured her a small cup of ice chips and helped her sit up slightly so she could take them.
"They're okay?" she asked, her voice little more than air. He nodded. "Yes. All four. They're fighting, but they're here."
Tears welled in Claire's eyes.
She couldn't remember the moment they were born, couldn't remember hearing their first cries or feeling the warmth of their skin.
But she had chosen this. And despite the cost, she had survived it. They all had.
That afternoon, a nurse came in to help her into a wheelchair. Claire hadn't yet seen her daughters, only glimpses through the NICU glass from her bed. The nurse guided her slowly across the corridor, for Pole trailing behind, every movement painful. The NICU was warm, filled with the steady rhythm of ventilators and monitors, the subdued voices of nurses and doctors moving with quiet urgency. Claire was wheeled next to the first incubator and leaned forward as much as she could.
There she was, Hope.
Just over 2 pounds, her skin translucent, her chest rising and falling with the aid of a CPAP machine. A tiny knit cap covered her head, and her eyes fluttered open for a moment before closing again.
Claire couldn't speak.
She reached through the incubator's porthole and touched the back of Hope's hand with her finger.
The baby's hand twitched slightly in response.
The nurse took her from one incubator to the next, Grace, her limbs twitching, Faith, whose heartbeat was the strongest, and Ivy, the tiniest, barely bigger than Claire's hand, but with a fighting pulse.
"They're incredible," the nurse said softly. "All four.
We don't see this often."
"It's nothing short of a miracle."
Claire nodded, unable to stop the tears.
She had no words, only gratitude and awe, and a sense of terror that sat just beneath the surface.
Each baby was alive, but they were fragile, living hour to hour.
The NICU would be their world for weeks, possibly months.
The outcome was still uncertain.
Back in her room, Claire wrote in her journal for the first time since surgery.
Day 30, I met them today.
Not as I imagined, not in a nursery with bows and lullabies, but through glass and wires and quiet hope.
Ivy is smaller than my hand. But she's here. That's enough for now.
The following days were a blur of physical recovery and emotional exhaustion.
Claire's blood pressure remained unstable. Her surgical wound required daily cleaning.
She had difficulty sitting up, couldn't walk more than a few feet without help, and needed medication around the clock. David moved between her room, the NICU, and the apartment where Lily and Max waited with Helen. He was stretched to his limit, but he refused to show it. He carried a journal of his own, tracking every doctor's note, every ounce gained by the babies, every shift in Claire's condition.
He rarely smiled anymore. He functioned. That was all.
One night, Claire saw him asleep in the chair beside her bed, his head leaning back, jaw slack, shadows beneath his eyes.
"Come lie beside me," she whispered. He stirred. "I don't want to hurt you." "You won't."
He hesitated, then climbed gently onto the narrow hospital bed beside her, resting one arm around her shoulders. She nestled into him, breathing in the scent of soap and exhaustion.
"I miss our life," she said. "I miss you in it," he replied. "We'll go home. One day."
David didn't respond immediately. Then he said, "What if they don't all make it, Claire?"
She closed her eyes.
"Then we hold the ones who do.
And we love them for the ones we lost."
There was no rehearsed wisdom, no poetic certainty, just raw, human truth. As the days turned into weeks, the babies began to stabilize. Hope and Grace were the first to breathe on their own.
Faith followed days later.
Ivy remained the most delicate, her lungs underdeveloped, her weight dangerously low. But she clung to life with a fierceness that confounded even the NICU staff. Nina, the night nurse, began referring to her as the little wildflower. "Because you'd think she'd break in a storm," she told Claire, "but she just keeps blooming." Claire began pumping breast milk, though her supply was low and her body weak. The nurses encouraged her to try skin-to-skin contact, and when she was finally able to hold Hope against her chest for the first time, Claire wept uncontrollably.
"I didn't know I could still feel this much," she said to Nina.
"That's the thing about surviving," Nina replied.
"It doesn't just keep you alive. It reminds you you're still human."
Meanwhile, back in Boone, rumors had begun to swirl. People talked, as they always did in small towns.
Some were amazed. Others were skeptical.
"She kept all four?"
a woman asked at the post office. "I heard she almost died."
Why would anyone do that to themselves?
But others began organizing. A neighbor set up a donation drive for diapers and formula. A local church offered to collect gently used baby clothes. One mother, whom Claire barely remembered from a PTA meeting, posted online, "This woman fought for her children. The least we can do is fight for her now." The story started to spread. Claire didn't know any of it yet. She was too consumed with the day-to-day, her own pain, her daughter's vital signs, David's weariness, Lily and Max's distant voices on video calls. She was surviving in a vacuum, where hope was measured by weight gains and oxygen levels. One evening, after visiting the NICU, Claire sat by the window of her hospital room, looking out at the parking lot below. David was downstairs getting coffee. The sun was setting, casting gold across the sky. She opened her journal again. Day 41. Today, Ivy opened her eyes and looked at me. Just for a second. But it was real.
She knew me.
Or maybe I imagined it. But it doesn't matter. For that 1 second, I wasn't broken. I was her mother. And that was everything. Outside, the sky turned from gold to violet. Inside, 4 tiny girls continued their silent, stubborn fight for life. And Claire, stitched and sore, held together by love and threadbare strength, began to believe that maybe, just maybe, this miracle was meant to last. Claire came home 73 days after the birth. It was a gray morning in late May when they finally left the hospital. The sky hung low with clouds, threatening rain, and Claire felt the weight of everything. 2 months in recovery, 4 fragile daughters still tethered to monitors, a family stretched to its limits. But the moment she stepped outside and took her first breath of Boone's mountain air, she knew, the hardest part wasn't over. It was just beginning. Only 2 of the babies, Hope and Grace, were released with her. Ivy and Faith remained in the NICU, needing longer respiratory support and nutrition monitoring. Claire left the hospital with empty arms for the second time. But this time, she left behind daughters she had named, held, cried over. Daughters she would return to as soon as she could.
David drove the van slowly back to Boone.
The back seat was stuffed with donated baby gear, hospital bags, medical supplies, and boxes of breast milk packed in ice. Claire sat in the front seat, silent, watching the mountains roll past like silent witnesses to the journey ahead. When they pulled into the driveway of their little cabin, the house looked smaller than she remembered. The paint on the porch rails had chipped. The roof was weather-worn.
The garden had grown wild.
Inside, everything was familiar, but somehow altered. The crib David had set up was in the living room. Bottles lined the kitchen counter. The dining table had been pushed against the wall to make space for swings and bassinets. Lily and Max ran out to greet them, their faces full of excitement and uncertainty. Claire bent slowly to hug them, pain rippling up her spine as she pulled them close. "I missed you more than the stars," she whispered. Lily hugged tighter. Max stared up at her, wide-eyed. "Are the babies really home?" "2 of them," Claire said. "We'll bring your other sisters home soon." That night, after feeding and diaper changes and a chaotic attempt at settling into something like a routine, Claire sat at the edge of the bed, her body aching in ways she couldn't name. David sat beside her, his hands trembling slightly as he rubbed his eyes. "I feel like I've forgotten how to be normal," he said. Claire nodded. "We're not normal anymore." In the weeks that followed, the house filled with sound, baby cries, toddler questions, the whir of the bottle warmer, the squeak of the old rocking chair.
Claire barely slept.
Her nights were consumed by feeding, pumping, changing, comforting. David returned to working part-time jobs in town, doing electrical repairs and maintenance for neighbors, while Claire stayed home with the babies. Her mother helped when she could, but her back had begun to give out, and she couldn't lift the infants anymore. Money disappeared faster than they could track it. Medical bills arrived daily. The insurance copays for Ivy and Faith's continued NICU stay piled up. Formula cost more than gas. Every dollar was spent before it reached their account. Claire kept track of everything: diapers used, ounces pumped, minutes of sleep. She started a spreadsheet for NICU updates, recording Ivy's oxygen levels, Faith's feeding progress, the doctor's notes. The weight of it all pressed down on her chest like a second pregnancy. One evening, after another long day, Claire found Lily in the hallway, staring at a drawing she had taped to the wall. It was a picture of their family: David, Claire, Lily, Max, and 4 tiny babies wrapped in different colored blankets. "They're always crying," Lily said.
"You don't sing to me anymore." Claire knelt besider. I'm sorry, sweetheart.
Mommy's just very tired. I know, Lily whispered. I just miss when it was quiet. Claire tried to smile but couldn't. Later that night, Claire stood in the kitchen heating a bottle while one baby screamed and the other stirred. She looked out the window at the dark yard, at the swing set David had built last year but hadn't had time to fix. Rain tapped on the glass. The bottle slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor. She stared at it for a long moment, then sank to her knees, sobbing into her palms. David found her there minutes later. He didn't say anything. He just knelt down and picked up the broken pieces.
I can't do this, Claire whispered.
You already are, he said. No, she said.
I'm surviving.
That's not the same.
They sat on the floor together, broken bottle between them, the baby monitor buzzing softly behind them.
The next morning, Claire called the NICU. I need to be with them, she said.
Ivy and Fête.
I can't be in two places, but I need to be with them. We understand, the nurse replied gently. They're both stable. Ivy's weight is improving. Faith took a full bottle last night. They're doing well.
Claire hung up the phone and cried again, not because of fear this time, but because of relief. For the first time in months, there was hope without terror.
That week, Claire began writing again. Not just in her journal, but publicly. She posted a short blog entry titled 4 Heartbeats.
In it, she described the journey so far, the diagnosis, the birth, the NICU, the pain and the choice.
She didn't embellish. She didn't ask for sympathy. She just told the truth.
Within days, her post spread. First through local parenting groups.
Then through regional news.
People wrote comments, sent messages of encouragement, shared their own stories. Some criticized her, of course, called her reckless, emotional, irresponsible.
But others saw something else.
You gave me permission to fight for mine, one mother wrote. Claire sat by the crib reading the comments, her eyes red with fatigue. For the first time, the world outside their little cabin in Boone began to lean in, not with judgment, but with curiosity.
With care. That night, she wrote in her notebook.
Day 85, I don't know how we'll make it through the next year. But I know we've already made it through what should have broken us. That has to count for something.
The rain stopped. The wind eased.
And for the first time in weeks, Claire slept, really slept, with 2 babies breathing softly beside her, 2 more waiting to come home, and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they weren't alone anymore.
It started with a knock at the door.
Claire opened it with one baby strapped to her chest and another balanced on her hip. A woman stood on the porch, mid-30s, blonde hair pulled into a ponytail, holding a grocery bag filled with diapers, formula, and a small envelope.
I'm Julie, she said, offering a tired smile.
Oui, haven't aimé. Il arrive tout street over.
I read your blog. I just wanted to help.
Claire blinked, unsure whether to invite her in or cry from exhaustion.
Thank you, she said finally. That's really kind.
Julie shook her head. You've done something extraordinary.
The least we can do is keep you in diapers.
After she left, Claire sat at the kitchen table, opened the envelope, and found a note.
You may feel alone, but you're not. Keep going. There was a $50 bill tucked inside.
That night, Claire added another post to her blog. She wrote not about the miracle of survival, but about the invisible aftermath, the sleeplessness, the loneliness, the guilt. She described the way Lily flinched at sudden noises now, how Max sometimes spoke in whispers like the NICU hush had followed him home. She described the moment she realized she hadn't looked at her own face in the mirror for days.
The post went viral within 24 hours.
By the end of the week, Claire had received more than 1,000 emails. Some came from other mothers of multiples. Others came from people who had made a different choice, who had reduced or miscarried or walked away, and thanked her for her honesty, even if their stories diverged.
But not all the messages were kind. She should have known better. Why have so many kids if you can't take care of them? This isn't courage. It's selfishness dressed as sacrifice.
Claire read them quietly, her fingers trembling. David found her that night sitting on the porch, the laptop closed on her lap, the monitor buzzing inside with cries she had stopped responding to for a moment just to breathe.
You okay? He asked. I don't know, she answered.
He sat beside her, wrapping a blanket over her shoulders.
I keep thinking, Claire said slowly, what if they're right? Who? David asked. The ones who say we were irresponsible. That we should have reduced. That we asked for this. David didn't answer right away. He looked out into the darkness where the pine trees stood still and silent. You didn't ask for 4 heartbeats, he said. You just refused to silence any of them. Claire nodded. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Later that week, a producer from a national talk show reached out. They wanted to feature Claire and David's story in a segment about impossible parenting decisions. It would be filmed in Charlotte. Expenses covered.
À brief interview. Nos signes dramatiques, day promisé.
David hesitated. Do we want more attention? Claire thought for a long time. Then she said, if we're going to be judged, I want to be in the room when it happens.
The studio was cold, the lights sharp, and the energy artificial.
Claire wore a simple blue blouse, her hair still damp from the rushed morning. David sat beside her in a navy button-up he hadn't worn since their wedding anniversary 2 years ago. They looked tired. Because they were. The host, polished and sympathetic, asked the expected questions. What went through your mind when you found out it was 4? What did the doctors say? What made you choose to carry all of them? Claire answered quietly but clearly. She told the story with the calm of someone who had lived through fire and could now speak from the other side, not with pride, but with presence. Then came the panel. A guest psychologist praised Claire's strength but questioned the emotional toll on the existing children. A pediatrician highlighted the NICU strain on hospitals in cases like this. Then came Tara Green, a successful entrepreneur, childless by choice, articulate and commanding. With all due respect, Tara said, we celebrate these stories as triumphs, but we don't talk about the cost. Financially, emotionally, environmentally. You chose to carry 4 high-risk babies knowing the burden it would place on your community, your family, and your limited means. Is that courage, or is it sentimentality pretending to be moral clarity?
The audience murmure.
Claire looked at her for a long moment before answering. I understand the question, she said. But I need to clarify something. We didn't ask for fanfare. We didn't ask for rescue. We just asked for space to try.
Fort à chance.
She paused. Would it have been easier to choose reduction? Maybe. Would it have made us safer, more secure, more palatable to society? Probably. But I looked at that screen and saw 4 heartbeats. I didn't see numbers.
I saw lives.
The room went still. I'm not here to tell anyone what they should do, Claire continued. I'm only here to say that when life handed us the impossible, we didn't walk away. We stayed. We suffered. We survived. The segment ended. They returned to Boone 2 days later, unsure of how it would be received. But the impact was immediate. Messages flooded in again. This time from a broader audience, grandparents who had lost children, doctors who had seen both miracles and tragedy, and strangers who simply said, thank you for showing what staying looks like.
Claire's blog grew.
Readers began to donate. Not just money, gift cards, baby formula, a used minivan from a family in Asheville, new cribs from a church in Georgia. A local college student set up a registry. Volunteers organized meal trains and childcare rotations. Suddenly, their mailbox was full. David wept when the first crate of diapers arrived with a note, one less thing to worry about. Claire wept when Ivy and Faith were finally released from the NICU, bundled tightly in soft blankets, their faces scrunched and pink, alive in a way that felt permanent now. That night, all 6 of them, Claire, David, Lily, Max, and the 4 babies, were finally home under one roof. There was no celebration.
No champagne.
No fanfare. Just a quiet dinner, followed by 4 simultaneous cries, a spilled bowl of mashed carrots, and Lily falling asleep with her head on the table. Later, Claire and David sat outside on the porch, the monitor buzzing softly between them. We're still underwater, David said. Claire nodded. But now we're learning how to breathe down here. They didn't know what would come next. They only knew they had made it this far. Not because of blind faith. Not because of attention. But because they had refused to give up, even when love alone wasn't enough, even when the world watched and questioned and judged. They had stayed. And that had made all the difference. For a while, it felt like they were turning a corner.
With all 4 babies finally home and the community rallying around them, Claire and David began to breathe again, just a little. The house was still cramped, the bills still pressing, and the exhaustion ever present, but the chaos had softened into rhythm. They were managing, 1 hour at a time. Claire continued to write. Her blog became a quiet haven for other parents, those in the NICU trenches, those with sick children, those who had lost and carried on anyway. Her honesty, unfiltered and raw, drew readers from across the country.
She shared everything. The joy, the grief, the ressentiment, the love.
She didn't pretend to be a hero. She was simply surviving, and somehow, that resonated more than perfection ever could. Then came the second invitation. This time, it wasn't a small segment. It was a prime-time panel discussion, part of a national series on parenting in modern America. The producers wanted Claire to join a conversation about reproductive ethics, access to care, and what they called the morality of choice. There would be doctors, ethicists, and parents, some who had reduced, some who hadn't. David was skeptical. You really want to go back into the fire? I don't know, Claire admitted. But they said we'd have time to really speak. Not just sound bites. He paused. They'll come for you. I know, she said. But I've learned something. What? That silence is its own kind of surrender. So they agreed.
Claire flew to New York alone this time.
The babies were too young to travel, and David stayed home with Lily, Max, and a rotating group of volunteers.
Claire sat in a hotel room the night before the show, watching over FaceTime a David Fedivi and Lily read Max a bedtime story.
I'm proud of you, David said softly. But please be careful. The studio was sleek, buzzing with energy. The producers rehearsed the show format, checked mic levels, and applied light makeup to each guest. Claire sat backstage in a quiet corner, rereading her notes, her palms damp. She didn't feel ready. But she rarely did these days, and she had learned that readiness was often a myth. When the lights dimmed and the cameras rolled, Claire sat on the far right of a semicircle of chairs. Next to her was a pediatrician, then a public health advocate, then a young woman named Mara who had undergone fetal reduction at 20 weeks after learning 3 of her quadruplets had genetic abnormalities. On the far end sat Tara Green, the same guest from the earlier talks now a co-host of the segment. The moderator began calmly, introducing each panelist and framing the discussion as a space for respectful dialogue. But it didn't stay that way. As the conversation deepened, tensions rose. Tara spoke with her usual eloquence. I don't condemn anyone's choices. But I do believe in accountability. We live in a country where medical resources are limited, and personal decisions have public consequences. When we glorify extreme pregnancies, natural or not, we send a dangerous message. Maura nodded. I loved every one of my babies. But I also knew I couldn't give all of them a chance at life if I didn't make the hardest decision of mine. The pediatrician added statistics about neonatal survival rates, the burden on NICU systems, and the trauma endured by older siblings. Then it was Claire's turn. She looked into the camera, not just at the studio audience but at the thousands, maybe millions, of viewers watching at home. I don't think I'm extraordinary, she began. And I don't think my decision was right for everyone. But it was right for me. I didn't choose 4 babies. I chose not to reduce them. I chose to accept what came, whatever the cost. That doesn't make me better. It just makes me responsible for my own choice.
Tara interjected.
But that's exactly the point. Your choice has become public. You've blogged about it. You've built a platform. You've received donations, help, praise. What about the people who made the opposite choice and were shamed into silence? I've never shamed anyone, Claire said, her voice sharp but steady. I've only ever told my story. Isn't that what we're all doing here?
Tara pressait donc. You're a teacher, Claire.
Would you teach your students that morality is a feeling? That courage means ignoring consequences because it feels right. Claire took a breath. No, she said. I would teach them that courage is staying when it's easier to leave. That morality is never black and white. That sometimes we make choices without guarantees, and we live with them, not because we're right, but because we're accountable. The room went still. Even the host didn't interrupt. Claire continued, her voice gentler now. I didn't do this to inspire anyone.
I did it because I couldn't live with the alternative. I look at my daughters now, Hope, Grace, Ivy, and Faith, and I see 4 stories that almost didn't get written. Do you know how many people told me they wouldn't make it?
That you wouldn't make it.
She glanced toward Tara. They weren't wrong. We almost didn't. The panel ended moments later. The audience offered quiet applause, but the energy was mixed, some admiration, some discomfort. Online, the segment exploded. Social media lit up with praise and vitriol. Claire's name trended nationwide.
Comment section split like Follines. She's a héros. She's irresponsible. She's brave. She's selfish.
The flight home was long and quiet. Claire didn't check her phone. She didn't read the articles. She didn't scroll the reactions. She watched the clouds instead, feeling the weight of the world's eyes retreat behind her. David met her at the airport, the babies bundled in blankets, Lily holding a welcome home sign made of crayon and construction paper. You did good, he said. I don't know, Claire answered. I told the truth.
D'été Saléiade.
Back home, life resumed its rhythm. Feedings, changings, cries, laughter. But something had shifted. Neighbors waved longer at the mailbox. A woman at the grocery store left a gift card at the register. A father in line at the pharmacy whispered, I saw you. Thank you. Claire returned to her blog, unsure how to write about what had just happened. She wrote anyway. Some people asked if I regret going on that show. I don't. But I'm tired. Tired of being a symbol. Tired of being measured against decisions no one else had to make. Tired of defending something that already cost me everything. I'm not here to be right. I'm just here to be real.
And the truth is, I chose love. Not the soft kind. The brutal kind.
The kind that bleeds and breaks and stays anyway. Outside, the rain began to fall softly. Inside, Claire sat in the quiet, one baby asleep on her chest, another curled in a swing nearby. She wasn't sure what came next. But whatever it was, she would meet it the same way she had met everything else. By staying. Autumn came late to Boone that year. The trees clung stubbornly to their green until late October, when the wind shifted and the air turned sharp. The Thompson house, now barely large enough for the chaos it contained, stood under a golden canopy of fading leaves. Inside, the days moved fast and loud. Feeds, naps, diapers, repeat. Claire had stopped trying to organize it all into perfection. There were baskets of clean laundry instead of folded drawers. Dishes were done when someone had the energy. The whiteboard in the kitchen listed bottle measurements and nap schedules, but was often ignored. What mattered most was that everyone was breathing, fed, and on most days, held at least once. She had stopped blogging for a while. After the talk show, the flood of attention had begun to feel more like a current threatening to carry her away than a lifeline. Claire didn't want to perform her motherhood anymore. She wanted to live it, privately and imperfectly. She answered only the letters that seemed deeply personal, the ones from women who had also lived through impossible decisions, who weren't looking for a debate, just for connection. One letter came from a woman named Julia, a retired nurse who had worked NICU shifts for 30 years. In slanted cursive, she wrote, I don't know your politics.
I don't care.
All I know is this, I've watched life arrive and leave in the same hour. What you did wasn't reckless. It was rare. Thank you for letting the rest of us see it. Claire read that one aloud to David one evening, both of them cradling sleeping babies. I don't feel rare, she said softly. You shouldn't have to, he answered. You should just get to be a mom. A few weeks later, Claire was invited to speak at a local community center, not as a spectacle, but as part of a small panel on postpartum mental health and maternal resilience. She agreed, not because she needed more exposure, but because this one felt different. Smaller. Grounded. The room held maybe 30 people. Some parents. A few grandparents. A nurse from the town clinic. Claire wore jeans and an oversized sweater. Her hair was in a braid. She stood behind a podium with a half-empty water bottle and no prepared speech. I used to think resilience was something you were born with, she began. Now I think it's something you earn. Or maybe something you just keep choosing.
Day after day.
Even when it feels like you're breaking. She talked about the isolation. About the guilt of not being able to give equal love to each child at every moment. About her rage and exhaustion. She talked about fear, not the fear of dying, but the fear of living with regret. She didn't mention the blog. Or the talk show. Or the backlash.
Just the babies. Just the long, hashing road to now.
After the talk, a woman approached her. She was younger than Claire, maybe mid-20s, wearing scrubs under her jacket. "I'm not a mom," she said. "I'm just a nurse at the clinic. But I followed your story since the first blog post. And I wanted you to know, when I see you, I don't see failure. I see fight." Claire didn't know how to respond. So she just said thank you.
That night, she walked home alone under a sky full of stars, her breeze forming small clouds in the cold.
When she reached the front door, she paused. Inside, she heard laughter. She stepped in to find Lily and Max building a tower of pillows, David bouncing Ivy in one arm while spoon-feeding Grace with the other. Hope was asleep in her rocker. Faith was babbling to herself near the window, blinking at the reflection of lights. It wasn't calm. It wasn't clean. But it was full. So impossibly full. Later that week, Claire returned to her blog. Not to post a viral essay or to reignite debate, but simply to update those who had followed them for so long. It's been a while. We're okay. That means something different every day. Sometimes it means we're all alive and fed. Sometimes it means one baby got a fever and the rest of us panicked. Sometimes it means I sat in the bathroom for 5 minutes alone and remembered I still have a body, not just a function. But we're here. There's no moral to our story.
No victory lap. No définitive leçon.
Only this: when we were told it wasn't possible, we stayed anyway. When it hurt, we stayed. When it didn't feel heroic, we stayed. And we will keep staying. Not because it's noble, but because it's ours. The post didn't go viral. But it reached the right people. The private messages that came were tender, quiet acknowledgments from people who had also stayed, in marriages, in grief, in parenting, in themselves. Then, something unexpected happened. A group of local mothers formed a network called the Stay Collective, not named for Claire, though the inspiration was clear. Their mission was simple: to support parents of multiples, preemies, and high-risk births with real help.
No judge.
Not opinions. Diapers. Meals. Rides to appointments. A warm meal and a hug. They met once a week. Claire started going, not as a speaker, but as a member. Sometimes she just listened. Sometimes she brought a casserole and sat silently in the corner. Sometimes she held someone else's baby so they could cry into their own hands. One night, after a meeting, she walked back to her van and found a note on the windshield. "You stayed. So I could too." Signed, Anonymous. Winter came early that year.
Snow dusted the mountain top before Thanksgiving.
The Thompson house adjusted again, babies in warmer onesies, heaters checked twice a day, soup simmering on the stove more often. David found part-time work fixing up cabins for a property company, and Claire began freelancing remotely, writing content for a health website late at night when the babies slept. The money wasn't much, but it gave her back something she hadn't felt in a long time: agency. One night in December, as the fire crackled in the living room and the kids lay scattered like fallen stars across the floor, Claire stood in the doorway with a cup of tea in her hands. "I was terrified," she whispered, almost to herself. David looked up from the couch. "When? Back then. When they said it wasn't safe. When I almost died.
When we almost lost Evie.
When you couldn't look me in the eye because we didn't know if we'd make it." He nodded. "And now?" he asked. Claire looked around the room.
At the noise.
The mess.
The improbable beauty of it all.
"Now I'm still scared," she said. "But it's a different kind. It's the kind that comes after choosing something you can't undo and realizing you'd still choose it again." And David, without a word, reached for her hand. They had no guarantees for tomorrow. But what they had was something better. They had stayed. Spring returned to Boone like an old friend who remembered the path home. The trees budded early, the rivers thawed, and the air smelled of damp soil and second chances. In the Thompson house, everything still ran on a rhythm dictated by the babies, now almost a year old, but something had shifted. The urgency was gone. The fear, though never far, had retreated to the background. What remained was the quiet understanding that life was no longer about survival. It was about presence.
On the morning of the girl's first birthday, Claire stood at the kitchen sink, watching sunlight filter through the curtain.
She held a cup of coffee, lukewarm but precious, and stared out at the yard, where David and Max were setting up a banner that read, 1 year strong. Lily was coloring at the table, humming to herself. The 4 babies were in their playpen, babbling, pulling at toys, occasionally tumbling over one another like puppies. Claire closed her eyes for a moment.
She could still remember the sound of the monitor flatlining in the delivery room.
Ivy's still body. The blood.
The white-hot panic.
And then later, the soft sounds of recovery.
The first cries.
The tiny weight of life placed in her arms.
A year. A full year.
She hadn't thought they would make it this far, not really.
She had hoped. She had prayed.
But somewhere inside, a part of her had always held a small funeral in reserve, afraid to hope too much, in case it invited more grief.
But now here they were.
David walked back in, brushing snowmelt from his jacket.
We should start setting out the cupcakes, he said. I think people are actually coming. Claire smiled.
That's what happens when you become the most famous family in Watauga County.
He grinned.
Fameux ou?
Then why are we still fixing our own plumbing?
I said famous, not rich.
Neighbors began arriving by late morning. Some brought casseroles, others toys or handmade cards. Julie, the woman who'd first shown up with diapers months ago, arrived with a hand-stitched quilt bearing the girls' names in tiny embroidery.
The retired nurse, Julia, came too.
So did a few women from the Stay Collective. Even Nina, the night nurse from the hospital, made the drive from Charlotte with a small box of preemie clothes and tears in her eyes. I can't believe how big they are, she whispered, holding Ivy, who clung to her pink pacifier like a medal. Claire found herself standing in the middle of it all, overwhelmed by how far the circle had grown. For so long, it had felt like just her and David against the world. But now the world had come in, not as judges, but as witnesses. After the cupcakes were eaten and the last guest had left, Claire and David sat on the back porch, their feet up, the sun dipping below the ridge.
They survived, he said. You did too, she replied. David leaned his head back.
So made me wonder if he ever told you how much he admire you.
Not just for carrying them, or for surviving all of it,
but for choosing it,
when you could have walked away from it all.
Claire looked at him. I didn't choose to suffer, she said.
I chose not to silence possibility.
That doesn't make me better than anyone else.
It just makes me, me. He nodded, quiet.
She turned toward him, her voice lower now.
But I couldn't have done it alone. You stayed too.
Even when I couldn't see you, you were there. David didn't answer right away. Then he said, I used to think love was what you say when things go right. But now I know, it's what you do when everything's wrong. They sat like that until the sun disappeared, until one of the babies cried and another stirred, and they rose together, just like always. That night, after the kids were asleep, Claire opened her laptop and began to write again. 1 year ago tonight, I was unconscious in a hospital bed, and 4 tiny lives were blinking into existence across a hallway.
Ivy wasn't breathing. I was bleeding.
And no one could tell David whether he'd lose all 5 of us before sunrise.
We survived.
But here's the part one never told you.
It wasn't just science. Or medicine. Or even luck.
It was the ordinary mundane work of people who refused to give up.
Nurses. Friends.
Strangers who dropped off groceries. Readers who sent notes that said, you're not crazy, just tired.
It was love, yes.
But the kind of love people don't write poems about. The kind that changes diapers at 3 a.m. The kind that works double shifts and holds your hand when you're too ashamed to speak.
The kind that stays.
We are not extraordinary. We are just one version of what can happen when people stay. And if you're reading this and you're in your own storm, just know, it does end.
Note latence.
But slowly. Quietly.
With breaths you didn't think you'd ever take again.
Stay. She clicked publish.
Then she turned off the light, crawled into bed next to David, and listened.
Not for cri. Not for alarm.
But for silence. For peace.
It was there now, threaded between the soft hum of the baby monitor and the steady breath of the man beside her.
She had made it. They all had. Not because she knew how. Not because she was fearless. But because when the world told her to let go, she held on. Because when the odds said run, she stayed. And sometimes, that is enough.